Good morning, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute. All right, we've still got folks joining in, but thank you for taking the time to join us today for our recap meeting, our last meeting of this engagement series. And we had, I think, 160 people signed up, so we'll imagine that some folks will be joining on in a bit. We'll give it just another minute and get started. Okay. Oops. Go ahead and get started here. All right. Thank you again for joining us. If you could just check out your Zoom box and adjust it if needed. We'd love to see name and organization if you can. And that will help as we're answering questions later on. So thank you for doing that. And still got a slew of folks joining, so I'm going to wait to run the poll in a second. My name is Kim Travis. I'm engagement coordinator in the Affordable Rental Housing Division and facilitating the meeting today. Appreciate all of the interest in joining us for this recap. And we'll go ahead and get started here with a poll just to get a sense for who is in the room today. I'm going to make sure that folks can see this poll. Who's in the room? Please let us know your role in affordable housing development. Take a minute to do that. All right, if you could just let us know one of these categories or what best fits your role in affordable housing development. Give that another minute. We got folks still joining in. Okay. Okay. Looks like we've got majority our developer and a handful of other folks, consultant, lender, investor, local government, other. All right. Thanks so much. We'll do a few polls throughout the meeting, so appreciate your participation. And with that, let me just make sure I've got all the folks admitted here. And we'll go through our agenda. So here is how we will spend the next 2 hours together. We will run through our process agreements and take some time to reflect on this engagement series, as well as share where we are with synthesis of your input that you've provided. The bulk of the meeting will be discussing themes and process. And Natasha will be sharing information that, building on information that was shared at the Friday Housing Stability Council meeting. Then we have some discussion questions today. So interested in getting some of your specific thoughts on the process, the framework that we're going to discuss today. Then we will talk about where we go from here and close the meeting. We're going to stay in a large group format today, so no breakout rooms. and hopefully we're able to have a productive dialogue. There's the chat function, the Q&A. Please raise your hand as needed for live questions, comments, all of those different venues to engage with you today. So don't hesitate to use the chat or Q&A as we go along. So with that, let me just check and make sure we've got a few folks still joining, but I'm going to move on here and just take a minute to review process agreements and how we're showing up to engage with you today, and hope that you will practice with us as we're looking to foster an inclusive environment, and asking for your active engagement in this meeting today, and consider how you speak your truth and speak your truth responsibly. Again, fostering an inclusive environment, listening to understand, and being willing to do things differently, experience discomfort, and expect and accept non-closure. If we're not able to answer all of your questions today, there may be things that we're not able to address, but our commitment is to get your, to recognize your input, and as we're able to respond, we will respond to your input. We do appreciate and value your input very much, but we may not be able to address all of it today. So with that, thank you very much for practicing those process agreements with us. Taking just a quick minute here to review and reflect a bit on the original engagement plan. We convened 6 meetings. We launched August 17th. As we launched this engagement process, we then had 5 meetings, and we committed to distributing materials in advance, using technical advisories, and for the meetings where we had multiple topics, we posted discussion documents for each meeting with specific questions that we were asking of you. In those meetings, the format was presentations at the meeting, which were recorded, posted on the website, and then using breakout rooms for smaller group discussions around those questions that we were asking you on the topics. Then, knowing that not everyone could attend the meetings and participate in the meetings, offered a survey after each meeting with those same questions. So if you weren't able to attend, you were able to provide your input via survey. And then we have committed to a synthesis of input by topic, and Mitch is going to talk in a bit about where we are with posting those synthesis and OHCS responses to the input. In addition to the 6 Zoom meetings that we convened, we did attend a wide variety of meetings to make sure that we had broad reach with this engagement. So we wanted to get the word out and encourage people to attend these large sessions. And we were also on hand to answer questions at many of these meetings about some of the topics and other questions that folks had. So we've been really busy collecting input over the last couple months, and we will be posting, finalizing an engagement summary and posting that on our website, and sharing that with you, just kind of encapsulating, all of these meetings and participation in these meetings and so forth. So just wanted to share with you where we've been and where you've been with us over the past few months, and we certainly appreciate that. It's been great to hear from all of you and have robust engagement. I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mitch to continue kind of recap and talk about where we are with developing synthesis for the input.
Thanks, Kim. Hi, everyone. My name is Mitch Hanoush. I'm the Senior Policy Analyst for the Affordable Rental Housing Division at OHCS. And I just put myself on mute by accident, so going great so far. I am here to give kind of, as Kim mentioned, a summary of all of the kind of input and feedback that we received. We've done a kind of thematic analysis of all of the different topic areas that we brought forward to you. We are still in progress for some of the more recent topic areas. As Kim mentioned, we are working on kind of a response document for every topic area, and we'll be posting those on the website. So if it's not on this list, that does not mean we're not thinking about it. It means we are still actively kind of grappling with a lot of the input that we got, which was plentiful, and we're really grateful for all of the insight and want to make sure that we're taking every point into account and being able to respond to as many as possible. So yeah, the themes that I'm going to be going through today around these topics are not all inclusive. We kind of pulled out what we heard as the most critical or common points of feedback for each of these topic areas. We'll have response documents for these topics as well, and we'll post those on the website along with the ones for the topics that won't be discussed today. Yeah, so I guess with that, let's move to readiness. So this was, as all of you know, kind of the biggest piece of this new process that we're talking about, which is why we wanted to present it first. It's kind of the crux of the whole thing, moving that kind of final commitment of resources closer to final readiness to proceed, closer to closing for each of your projects. We got some really great input on potential barriers this might cause, potential concerns this raises, and have done our best, I think, to craft a process that addresses a lot of these concerns. Natasha is going to be going into detail on sort of where we're at on that later, and excited to continue, working on ways that we can help mitigate some of these concerns. Primarily, the number one thing we heard was that shift in timing really adds cost and risk upfront for developers. There's kind of a huge amount of pre-development funding that folks have been sort of relying on OHCS's early commitment to be able to support. And without that early funding commitment, that adds a lot of risk to folks who would be taking that on out of pocket or having to secure pre-development funding. And the real desire there, I think, was for funding certainty, the concern that all of this pre-development funding would be, or costs would be taken on out of pocket and potentially wouldn't even reach construction financing with the project, and be able to kind of repay those costs that were taken upfront. So the general need for predictability and consistency. So how transparent are we being with sort of what is going to get a project funded and get that final commitment, as well as sort of consistency, not changing our criteria often so that folks can kind of know and project ahead of time to different years or different timing for their projects, that they'll know that they'll be able to kind of come in and meet those criteria that we've established. There's also a lot of concern raised for less resourced organizations, particularly small rural organizations and culturally specific organizations, and folks with smaller balance sheets who aren't going to be able to take on a lot of those costs up front out of pocket. So thinking of ways that we can support those organizations early and provide funding as well as sort of that technical assistance support. And again, I think Natasha will get into it later, but I think we are very aware of this as a need and are working on sort of ways that we can address that. The other kind of big point that was raised a lot that I wanted to call out here was that sort of synchronization and streamlining with other funders, whether private or public, really thinking about how this shift in timeline impacts lenders and investors and making those commitments, as well as other kind of federal or local funders. So thinking about USDA and HUD timelines and requirements, as well as sort of priorities at a local public funder level and what they're thinking about, and some requirements that private lenders have for commitment before they're willing to take a risk on a project. So all of those have been heard loud and clear, and we're hoping that our new kind of process that Natasha will talk about addresses a lot of these up front, but are excited to hear your thoughts on that too. Next slide, please. So kind of relatedly, and I do want to say, while we were looking at all of these kind of on a topic by topic basis, a lot of the input and feedback was covering a lot of different topics. This is a one process that has a lot of different factors and a lot of pieces that are all interconnected. So a lot of the conversation on readiness really fed into sort of the feedback that we heard around pre-development. As shown in the last slide, one of the big themes was the need for pre-development funding. So this was just so our second engagement was around pre-development, pre-qualification, and the DEI agreement. The pre-development topic was mostly around the $9.7 million that we received in pre-development funding from the legislature, specifically to help projects get to readiness. And so a lot of the feedback that we received was pretty programmatic, because those were the questions we asked, which is great. We really wanted to kind of get into the nuts and bolts of what's going to work and what folks need. And so, yeah, we heard that the proposed cap of 500,000 was insufficient and wasn't going to meet really anyone's needs. Costs were higher than that, and the need for kind of a greater investment was there. Kind of connected to that was a desire for broader eligible uses. So as we sort of establish new thresholds and new expectations and greater readiness standards, there's a desire to have our pre-development funding obviously be able to pay for those costs that folks are going to have to incur up front. We heard a lot of really great input on this, including community engagement and outreach, a lot of different types of studies and upfront costs that are required around professional services. We heard environmental studies and HUD environmental reviews and geotechnical reviews and permitting and development and architectural design, arborists, all sorts of things that really, I think, hammered home to me the need to make this a really flexible funding source in terms of what it's able to pay for. And I think that really we're leaning towards making this available to any cost that can be proven is tied directly to a project and is going to help that project get to a readiness standard that we're establishing. So trying to keep it as broad and flexible as possible while working with folks kind of early on so that they know if they can access this or not. Sort of also related to kind of the cap being insufficient, I think there was a lot of input on a desire to see how this could work with other funders and CDFIs. If you remember that presentation, one of our key goals of this program is to make sure it's working in line with other resources and CDFIs in particular who have this type of funding already. How can we kind of help be greater than the sum of our parts, fill a need, fill a gap? And we've, kind of, I think, started along this path. We've met with CDFIs initially, and I think have a concept in place that we're hoping we can, continue to move forward with that group of partners. There seems to be a path forward there, which is really exciting. I think one of the other kind of pieces of feedback we heard a lot from both CDFIs and other partners was that desire to make sure any sort of collaboration with other funders would be simple, make sure an application process is streamlined, take out any complexity that might exist, share information, work together, essentially. And that was heard loud and clear. And we want to make sure that that's kind of where we're going in the future. There was similarly a question around clarity with connection to, in particular, the land acquisition program, but sort of all of other OHCS funding programs. How does this flow into our capital funding? Is this like guarantee of OHCS funding in the future, which I think is not the case. But if we're establishing readiness standards and kind of a further clarity on thresholds and that predictability piece, I think any sort of pre-development funding that helps you meet those standards would have equal opportunity to get funded in the future. We also heard a lot around capacity building. And so how does this fit into that ecosystem of funding at OHCS in particular? And yeah, sort of a desire to just get more clarity and transparency when we come up with that piece. Also, forgiveness opportunities and recourse was a big piece of this. If we're jumping in early and trying to provide funding, especially for the feasibility loan product that was presented, that's really intended to get in ahead of early feasibility benchmarks that folks are trying to accomplish. What does forgiveness look like there, and what's the potential recourse for folks that aren't able to get to construction financing? And that was also heard loud and clear in Mirarty and conversations on what that might look like, and trying to formalize that so folks can kind of understand and know ahead of time what that looks like. Next slide. So the next two topics, pre-qualification and DEI agreement, were we got a lot of feedback on both of these, but they were pretty similar. There was a lot of desire for pre-qualification. A lot of this was high-level feedback. It was a pretty high-level concept that we presented. So really, it was goal-oriented process feedback. The desire was for this to be helpful and simple, which I think we definitely understand, but made us consider that we probably need to think about how we're presenting this and how we're structuring this to make sure that it's not seen as such. I think there was some folks that thought this might become punitive or complicated, and we really want to assure you that that's heard, and we want to make sure that this process is not that. We want it to be supportive and help folks simplify their process. Transparency around this, I think this was probably stemmed from folks who were unclear on sort of what the expectations were, which is understandable because I think we were still working and hoping to get feedback on what those expectations should be. So we'll make sure to communicate any decisions made here. There's also a desire for flexibility. So how can we make sure that, especially around timelines and potential kind of documentation, if there's things that are not what we're expecting, how do we kind of work with partners instead of using this as some sort of punitive measure? Next slide. So the DEI agreement similarly was pretty high level, was thinking about kind of structural and process concerns. A lot of conversation around accountability, thinking about sort of where this goes in the future. I know, so the option we presented, or the phase one version of this that we presented, is very much data collection and attempting to kind of work with folks on how to kind of establish those baselines and see where you're going. There was a lot of questions about how that's going to be measured. How do we ensure folks are actually doing the things that they're responding to us with? And then also a question about how, if we're doing any type of accountability, what that would look like community to community, and how we would differentiate there. I think, and as well as like clarity around expectations and process, similar to the pre-qualification responses, there was a lot of kind of need for further conversation, I think, and communication around sort of what this is going to be used for, and how we are going to be engaging with folks in their kind of initial submissions of these. And I think this is a really exciting process because OHCS is going to be doing this at the same time. We're also going through the same global diversity, equity, and inclusion benchmark standards. And so to have our partners doing it at the same time, I think gives us a really cool opportunity to sort of work alongside, as opposed to sort of our traditional, government role of kind of this really strict accountability standard. But we definitely want to work with folks on how we can unpack that and how we can kind of create kind of more structure there than you saw in that initial presentation. Lastly, equity and racial justice strategies. We heard a lot of feedback, and again, this is a very cross-cutting one. We've heard this type of feedback through every topic area, which is great, and I think speaks to some of the direction that a lot of our partners have been going on this type of work, which is really exciting. OHCS has obviously been taking a hard direction in this role and prioritizing equity and racial justice in the last few years in particular. And it's encouraging that partners are thinking about it in every aspect as well. So this is really cross-cutting feedback. We heard a lot around culturally specific organizations throughout kind of all of our topic areas, specifically thinking about how we're defining culturally specific organizations. What is a culturally specific organization? How partnerships are defined and considered was a big point of feedback in a lot of our conversations. So, what is a minimum stake in a project look like? What is the threshold in which we'll consider or give credit for a development team having a partnership with a culturally specific organization, having that project meet some standard of that being a culturally specific organization, things along those lines, and sort of what that looks like. And then there was also similarly, relatedly, a conversation around capacity for culturally specific organizations and sort of how to account for sort of the lack of capacity, thinking about how can we support CSOs in that exist already in kind of expanding capacity to be able to take on more projects, as well as helping kind of more nascent CSOs or kind of CSOs that don't exist yet stand up and support some projects in ways that they otherwise might not be able to. So and how do we account for projects that are attempting to work with CSOs and making good faith efforts, and the CSOs that are available to them are simply at capacity and unable to take extra projects on. So all of those are, it's a balance then where we're working on sort of what those standards might look like. Clarity on minimum requirements versus preference or aspirational. So this is sort of a conversation topic we brought up in the threshold conversation. So trying to think about what is a baseline expectation, a minimum requirement for all projects coming through the door to even be considered for funding, versus something that is seen as something that would give an advantage or some type of preference over other projects that are coming in, or even simply something that we hope to see from projects but aren't really holding anyone accountable to. So that's a kind of ongoing conversation, but is heard and is something that we are discussing internally, actively thinking about kind of that balance between what we can expect of every project versus hope to see in projects as often as possible. Somewhat related to that, the differences between communities came up a lot in feedback, in particular the urban-rural. I think that was heard in a lot of different conversations, is how we kind of balance urban versus rural priorities, especially if we are setting kind of minimum requirements, what that looks like differentiated by geography. I will say we did hear some great feedback, I think, too, on the challenges with establishing minimum requirements between communities of color as well. So if we're establishing baseline expectations, sometimes that doesn't account for the need that different communities have. So one BIPOC community may, have a specific threshold need that projects that are meeting that minimum requirement are able to do. Other communities of color might need something different. And if that's not covered by that minimum requirement, we're doing a disservice to specific communities, and we need to be aware of that. So that was heard loud and clear. So thinking about where we set those lines is still an ongoing conversation, but some great feedback around that. Centering community and the impact to tenants came up a lot, just making sure we're keeping the end user in mind and making sure that we're considering what the impact to tenants is. I think that's something we always strive to do, but that was a large point of feedback to make sure we're continuing to do that. There was a desire to see some greater accountability to commitments made. This was kind of from both perspectives. So from our perspective, how are we holding projects and development teams accountable to commitments they're making up front, saying they're going to have particular service provision or particular amenities in the project that are serving particular communities. How are we holding them accountable to that once the project is funded? As well as sort of the other perspective, how are we holding ourselves accountable to commitments we're making at OHCS, and sort of holding ourselves to standards that we're setting up front, especially if we are kind of expanding our minimum expectations. How are we making sure that we're holding ourselves to those minimum expectations when we're funding projects? And lastly, just sort of more resources was brought up a lot. How do we target more resources to these communities and the organizations serving them, which is something we grapple with a lot in-house, and thinking about ways that we can do that is very much front of mind. So that was a lot. Again, we're going to have these kind of documents, response docs posted on the website in the next few weeks that'll cover all of these topics with kind of line by line feedback we received, particularly from the retro boards and the surveys, but it will incorporate kind of thoughts from a lot of these kind of focus groups and stakeholder outreach that we did. And yeah, we'll send a technical advisory when those are ready to go, so you can kind of hopefully dig in and unpack some of what we talked about today and some of the stuff we didn't get to today. So, thank you.
Thanks, Mitch.
And I'll hand it off to you, Kim, or Natasha, somebody. Okay.
Yeah, well, I think great. Yeah, I really appreciate just that opportunity to reflect for a minute on, where we've been and what we've heard from the participants who have invested time in attending these meetings. So it's great to just have that moment to reflect, and thanks for highlighting these themes. And yeah, watch for a technical advisory when those are finalized and posted. Yeah, I think now we're going to turn over to Natasha and referencing materials that were presented at Housing Stability Council on Friday. Go ahead, Natasha.
Right. Hello, everybody. Hope you're doing well. This is Natasha, Director of ARH here at OHCS. Echo again all of the appreciation for all the engagement to date, and continuing to be here with us in this work where we are really critically needing your input and your expertise to inform how we end up building this plane and then putting it into place. And I'll stop that reference because I was starting to talk about flying and everything, and we're gonna stay grounded. Okay, I'll stop. Okay, so this has been, and I think we've kind of checked in on this every one of these engagement sessions. This is a really complex network of connections, of really critical large bodies of conversations. Mitch just highlighted a handful of them, and each of them surely requires days of conversations just by themselves. And so I think as we have gotten initial input from this group, lots of different side conversations that Kim has talked through earlier, more planned and anticipated as we do this pivot from getting input on kind of disconnected concepts to getting input on a collective structure that should reflect and be responsive to what our goal is to make that reflect and be responsive to what we have heard around critical need, balancing priorities that we as the state have in terms of fostering and expanding production, given the resources and tools that we have available to us, and then also what the development community needs for process efficiencies, for accessing private capital, for accessing investor participation, and all of these pieces that connect in. And so, and part of that obviously is also then jurisdictions, who are the other funders in the room and in the space, to be able to really drive this work to impact. And so what I did last Friday in our Housing Stability Council space, and Housing Stability Council, for those that maybe are less in the daily of OHCS business, as our statutory policy advisory body. And so that is a group that both is, required to around funding approvals. So we have detailed administrative rules that carve out and statutes and associated rules that carve out what are the things they need to approve from a dollar perspective. And then they also have this policy objective and intentions around making sure that we are creating programs and processes that align with the objectives and the goals that we as an agency and they as Housing Stability Council have for our work as a collective. And so this process, our funding calendar, our funding frameworks, how we're getting the resources out will end up being translated into framework documents, and they will be introduced to that Housing Stability Council body. They will give input formally, and we will also need to have them adopt it before we put into place. And so as we have been walking this process externally with partners, I've also been on a monthly basis bringing conversations to the council to be able to also reflect some of the things that we are hearing from partners, kind of get an understanding and build shared understanding about what our objectives and our goals are. And figuring out then how we kind of incorporate all of this. And so what I did last Friday with Housing Stability Council is start to build some of this, kind of start doing some of this flipping of the dial, where we, again, have been input on disconnected factors, and now starting to look at what is the vision that might start addressing these and what can we put into place. And so this is, like, when we're thinking about, decisions, this is trying to formulate the start of decisions. Again, this is a engagement in earnest. This is not a solution that's been sitting on the shelf this whole time, and we just been not sharing it. That would have been great if there was a magic solution, but we're actively working to hear and be responsive as we create strategies. In any case, so this, and I think on our engagement webpage, we posted a copy of the presentation that I went through last Friday. We're using portions of that document here in the presentation that we're walking through today. It's minorly different, but there'll be some similar, a lot of similar visuals here. But so I think it will be relevant both to, I think we have been really talking about the mechanics of our process and all of that. But I want to just also bring to this space a reflection of our organizational impacts. What does this work look like internally in their division? So you're understanding what it is that we're creating to make sure that we can run with this when we have it ready. And then get into the themes and the kind of the themes that we've been hearing, and how we are trying to think about some really tangible strategies to address and direct that. And so I think then maybe next slide. So from an organizational perspective, this is, OHCS has become a large agency. We have 3 core programmatic divisions. There's a home ownership division. There's the housing stabilization division, which has homeless services and energy services. And then there we have the affordable rental housing division. There are other groups in the agency as well, including disaster recovery and emergency order implementation groups that are doing those specific bodies of work. But we are I think we're the largest programmatic division in the agency, focused really exclusively on rental housing in the state. And this isn't something I think we tend to, lead with. This is our org chart. They're not the most exciting to look at, but I want to kind of highlight a few things. The groups that are that I've highlighted in black font are the new teams that are being created. And so I think maybe we have this on the next slide in words. Maybe I will flip to the next slide to kind of talk about what that impact is. So focusing on expanding the leadership team. So carving out creating a new operations team that is specifically thinking, as our division has grown, we need more directed roles around internal coordination, data, and process documentation and standards and trainings and all of those kinds of things. We have previously had development resources and production. The production analysts as on the same team, and that has worked really well, and the group has gotten really big, and these are big bodies of work. So we have separated those two kind of reporting functions. So Roberto Franco will continue to be the assistant director over development resources, along with Amy Cole, where we will also be standing up a new application team that is going to focus exclusively on applications and processes, where previously each of the program managers have led their own individual funding efforts. And to tell you that they're wearing 100 hats is probably too simple to say, but so we will have a concerted and dedicated application team to support that under Roberto. In the development resources side, Ty Dunstan Strain has accepted the new position of assistant director of production. And that team will also expand to add in the pipeline and technical advisor team. And so we are, I think, in active recruitment on some of those technical advisor positions. We will be recruiting that new pipeline technical advisor role. Hint, hint, if anybody thinks that's a good fit for you or somebody that you know. But this will expand the scope of work on that production team to have a forward-looking, externally focused team focused on providing in-depth, relationship management and technical guidance on what are the right resources that might fit your project, what are the concerns we can have, be able to look at projects as they start early. Other revisions are, the creation of that operations team with a data systems team. We'll include expand an actual presence and increase capacity around the data quality and reporting out of our system to be able to really support that work well. And then within our policy and planning group, we'll be standing up a new strategic initiatives team. Some of these roles exist already, but they will be kind of moving them into that planning and policy space where they will be focused on making really, impactful, focused on impactful decision-making framework, policies and planning around specific initiatives. So thinking preservation, MWSB, architecture, PSH, financial production strategies. So a place that really has the ability for those individuals to both do effective work connecting with program and deploying resources, and also be engaging in long-term, big picture conversations and making explicit connections across. And so I'm really excited about that as ways to be able to support and sustain this work. And I think specific to this funding process, the idea that we will have an application team that is leading, will be the single point of contact for submitting applications, and that we will be standing up again this technical advisor team to be able to be providing early feedback. And so I think the next slide. So this is it probably got here from our engagement webpage, but that's a reiteration of the engagement webpage. And then just kind of talking through with Housing Stability Council as all of these different topics roll up. Some of the main questions we're really asking and trying to get answers to is, how do we put out resources? What do those processes look like? What are benchmarks associated with that? And then how do we reuse the resources? So if we're thinking about making it kind of very general and sounding a little bit simpler than it really feels, is kind of rolling up to these themes. And so in next slide, and I think I touched on these in our last conversation a couple of weeks ago, but there, I think, and this was, I think, echoed in Andrea Executive Director Andrea Bell's email out to many of you that have been participating in engagement is, just, kind of 3 key themes that we have been hearing as we have done this engagement. And I think it's not reflecting all of it by any means, but I think around the application process and kind of big umbrella level on that, thinking about process, or responsiveness to project specific situations, and then, how are resources set aside to ensure access where there's risk that there might not be any. So I kind of walk through each of those. So this, this theme summary is really, I think, comes down a lot to process. I think, as Mitch signaled earlier, that we have heard very clearly that projects need clarity early about whether they'll be able to access and secure resources. And so as we create a process, we must build in that early clarity. And we intend to do so by creating a process that provides early conditioned commitment of resources. So go to the next slide. Thank you. So, and this was, I think we'll end up with a, well, anyway, this is my shot at putting it on a chart. So this has been, we've used this, display of what a total development process looks like over this, 5-year time period. Previously, or currently, that blue box at the top is where our entire interactions really are focused in the funding process. So external to OHCS participation, you're creating your concept, you're doing your feasibility, and then all in this space we have all of the requirements and are set up in a competitive environment. So get them all ready at the same time, submit by the same date, evaluated on the same at the same timeline, and you either pass thresholds or you don't. If you don't, you're not eligible anymore. Then you're evaluated and scored, and either you are successful in getting a reservation or you don't. And if you don't, the choice is to then come right back, look at that calendar, see when the next offering is going to be scheduled, and go through that whole process again. Our anticipation, kind of in thinking about how do we make sure that we are looking toward expanding capacity, fostering, getting projects into community. So we don't benefit if we've issued a reservation. We benefit as a state when there's a housing unit to house someone who needs it. And so that is the objective and that is the goal. And so then that becomes, a driving force. And so what feels, as we've kind of synthesized all of what we have heard, it felt really important that we are responsive both to the idea that not every project is ready on the same timeline. Not every project is going to, that March 31st deadline to submit a full application with everything flagged, identified, and done is going to fit what a community has been working on or what you have on your plates and what you have on your desk. And so thinking about what are the opportunities to break that, what is now very concentrated, into breaking it apart. And I think, importantly, I don't think breaking it apart means that you need to go slower through this process, but more that we want to follow you with your process. And so we do need to make sure that when we're holding resources to project, they're able to move forward and that they are having that impact, but that perhaps by having earlier and more kind of a lower entry point at each application or process of moving forward, we're able to more effectively prioritize your time and your efforts and your costs that you're spending on projects and your teams to submit these applications, to kind of right size that and make sure that it is all effort that is getting you further toward developing your project instead of further toward submitting your application. And so this has really been broken out into 4 key steps. First being a project intake step where these are, not completely baked ideas. This is what I'm working on. Let's talk to your technical advisor. And we would be able to have the opportunity then to say, you know, this seems like this would pass, you know, XYZ. Here's the program, the resource types that would be a fit for it, and really actually be able to bring out key, be able to share very actively kind of what are the resource terms, what do we have available, what is it that we have there, and then moving it forward. So this is showing next a financial eligibility review. Let's look at the pro forma. What does that show? You know, in a similar way that maybe you bring them today in a NOFA, you've some really strong ideas about what that looks like, not your final, but very strong. Let's review that, get a conditional commitment of resources so we can hold resources. And I'm gonna kind of, maybe let's trying to decide. Okay, well, anyway, I'm gonna continue the slide. There's more detail on the next, but I want to get through this. But so then a process of financial eligibility. Next, we're calling it impact assessment. But what are the policy objectives this project is meeting? Has the project sufficient equity and racial justice ties to it? What are the target populations? Have you created a responsive strategy that meets the project needs? All of those. And then finally, at that place, and so conditional commitment again at that space, and then at project commitment is where we are getting that final funding recommendation. You have more baked information about your costs. You're getting very close to being able to move forward. We can kind of hint towards that 6-month timeline. And then we get a final reservation letter or commitment letter of resources, and know that you have like a direct pathway. You are continuing to move on to get those resources and the project into the community. I think now I'll go to the next slide. And so it all ties together again. So another theme that we've heard is that we need to be able to be nuanced to the specific situation that projects are operating under. There are, it depends on where you are located. It depends on what population you're serving. It depends on how many stories your building is. It depends on what the parking requirements are. It depends on what your jurisdiction permitting timeline. So many of these, it depends. There is no way that we would want nor would be able to achieve this is the arbitrary deadline, right? Like we would have to be not really based on information and data. It is going to be based on generalisms, which isn't going to meet any project's need to be too general. And so the concept here is that as we, again, the project intake stage, it's intake, it's putting it on our radar, making sure that you have access to our technical advisors where desired or needed. And, that could be a place where our pre-development starts to be kind of stepped in and highlighted. That could be, there's a potential that there's some capacity leverage. I think we haven't gotten all of that pinned down into a directed strategy right now, but I think, those are the conversations we're having. But then as you get to the, step 2, 3, and as you get to the financial review, being able to give that conditioned commitment, which then goes into like, what is the conditions? Like, what is it? We're saying we're holding X million dollars for this project. How do you retain those resources? And that's where we have our benchmark strategy. So identifying what are the performance benchmarks that you are saying are associated with this. Again, our goal, getting resources to community, to those units to exist. And so benchmarks would be, in my perspective, time related. So in this step, I'm going to trying to think of one, get an LOI from a lender. I will do that within the next 6 months, or I will do that in the next 2 months. And then we hold projects. So we kind of come up with clear list of benchmarks. Projects, as they are going through this, will identify these are the timelines that I will perform within. I need to put bounds on that, right? I don't want a project sitting in a step for 2 years. So it's, thinking about what is that reasonability? When do we know that we're going to move forward? And then if you're meeting it, then you continue with your conditional commitment. You get everything ready to be able to evaluate it in the next step, and then the next step, and you're able to then get the I don't know that it'll even need to be a project commitment or reservation letter. It might just be a commitment letter that we can achieve at that point in time. But thinking about having projects themselves identify their performance benchmarks, and then we need to in turn hold you to them. And that will be a way of measuring, understanding when we're going to be seeing things moving forward, when we need to resource it in different ways from a staff perspective. And also as an opportunity to say, like, let's say a project is getting through and they're like, oh, I really thought I was going to be able to secure that resource. I didn't. I need to rethink that. And then we say, instead of, okay, come back in a year when we have another opportunity to come in here, you say, okay, I'm going to have to recast my submission. I will start over. Let's get a new conditional commitment with a new perspective, the new project or whatever the strategy is there defined. So it wouldn't be, that it's not hopefully less of a feast or famine situation and more of a, let's make sure that we have a responsive project. You don't always have to go back to step 0. You can just restart where you need to pick that back up. And this also, I think, is like, anticipating, connections in this both intake process with the technical advisors, to be able to bring in more participation and conversation with participating public funders and other jurisdictions that are either working directly already with these projects or are anticipating these projects going into their communities. I will say, as we have continued to unpack discussion coming out of our housing stability conversation, I think one of the curiosities that we have been kind of talking about is that, is it really pro forma that should be reviewed first? Right? Should that impact, like, should we be leading with the policy objectives and very high level back of the napkin on financial first, and then give the time for the cadence of that, right? Because thinking about, especially on partnership and ERJ strategies, though, that is work that should be informing the entirety of your project. So does that make sense to look at that on the earlier side than that detailed pro forma where we know that work needs to be reflected in the line items? So I think that's a question that we will kind of queue up for discussion a little bit later. And I see in the chat, Meg, a question about how long each of these steps would take. I think it really needs to be nuanced and responsive to the project. And it is important that if a project is like, tomorrow it's ready, you're saying like, I am permit ready, I am all of that. I think you'd be able to say, I can come on in, give us all of the stuff, we'll evaluate it, get you that conditional commitment until you're 6 months out and you're ready to go. And so really wanting to be able to make sure that we're responding to project timelines. I do think we need to say not longer than, right? So if you're in financial eligibility and maybe we allow, and I think that's we don't know, but I think should you be able to sit in one of these steps for, maybe we put like 6 month or 9 month timelines on them, like not to exceed amounts, but that you in establishing your project specific benchmarks need to say, here's my project plan. This is when this is anticipated to happening. I'll give myself a couple week cushion, but this is where, if I haven't achieved this, then I am not going to continue to move forward as I've anticipated. And so figuring out how to do that in a way, I really think, and I think to the idea of having both an application team and a data team, it would feel like my ideal state if we have a very clear, transparent list of projects that we have on our desks in the different steps, and are they meeting the benchmark? So, A, B, C, D benchmarks, are they red, yellow, green? I mean, I don't think it needs to be rocket science, but I think we need to be able to have some clarity about what projects are holding resources and for so long. And so I think then the next theme, I know this is a lot. Oh, go ahead.
One sec. Meg had a follow-up question about leading with equity in mind. And I think that's maybe what we're going to talk about is like what comes, should we be looking at impact or financial eligibility? And we want to get that kind of input today. So
absolutely, yes. And so I do think, yeah, so leading with equity, I think, as like the idea of, is financial really the first thing that we prioritize and review and get response to, or is it really impact, under which I think a wide array of equity alignment is going to be reflected, as well as meeting tenant needs and all of those types of factors. And so again, as a result of that conversation with council, and really, candidly, we have internally been struggling with, what does a pro forma review look like if not for the policy objective, right? Like, so you need to read the pro forma, understanding what the project is doing, so it feels hard to think of those as separate. And I think we also have, I think I put it first initially because I think ahead of, well, that's the initial threshold review, is does it pencil? And I think that we, thinking about where can we kind of release a little bit of our traditional practices and really focus on making sure that we have it. We will have clarity about what resources available and how they can be used. So projects will need to be able to work within whatever that looks like. And then what is it that we want to kind of prioritize at different steps. I think this also ties completely into the conversation that I know a lot of that has come up quite a bit around, are we first in or last in? What's the perspective and what's the strategy here? And I think we do need your input on that. I think, again, at final commitment, everything needs to be secured. At project intake, no, you don't have to have anything secured, right? I mean, I think you would start pursuing those strategies when you are, if we're, depending which one comes first, financial review or impact assessment, could we set it up so that securing resources that are anticipated as part of your benchmarks, that could work. What if we did a pro forma review, you said, I've applied for whatever, X million dollars in HUD funding, and the awards will be made in September. September comes, you don't get that funding award. We know that you need to start kind of recast that pro forma, and you need to do that again. If you get it, that's great. You continue on your strategy, you've met that benchmark, and you can move forward.
We take a question from Steph before we move on. Go ahead, Steph.
Hi guys.
Hey.
I just had a question. When will this process be open to submit deals to OHCS? We're ready. Let's do it.
I understand. Yes. And we have to we have to finalize this process, get it through Housing Stability Council, and we need to implement it. And so again, we're transitioning to the making recommendations and moving things forward. I know I will be we will be working with our Housing Stability Council and the governor's office to make sure that we are aligned and that we are agreeing to how we want to put these resources out. I'm incredibly optimistic that we will be putting resources out around by March. I think locking in our funding framework in early 2024 so that we are able to do that work. I will say it's a big lift. I'll also flag that our 4% and private activity bonds remain incredibly constrained, and that's not that's not a simple problem that we have to solve here. And so I just, I think with awareness about what types of resources, I think gap only or lift only transactions will be, first to be able to move forward with. I think we'll need to put out some kind of draft concepts about resource attribution and funding caps in the near term so that we can get those details really moving forward. But yes, I'm hopeful that we are looking at, end of the first quarter, start, March, April is what we're, our goals are at this point in time to be able to get more resources out. Absolutely.
And is that like could we go in earlier with intake to at least know like where we stand with the deal?
That's a
Or
good point. Yeah, we have just right now hiring our application team. And so I think that is the group that will drive that. And so I think as a practice, and we're also hiring our technical advisors to be able to get their feet under them in that body of work. And so I think to the degree that we have those folks in place, that we could probably start doing an onboarding. We could try to
Cool.
figure out how we can do an onboarding into an intake form at some point in advance of that. I do think honestly that it is, in the Wayback Machine, we used to have regional advisors that were the connections in their community to housing development and maintained their own lists of projects that had reached out and gave us kind of a lot of forward clarity about what projects we
Heads up.
anticipate coming in.
Mhm.
And that we have a lot of conversations where we try to do that. I think, Ty is a classic gatherer of project pipelines and queues, and that it will be so incredibly helpful to actually have a clear
Heads up.
process for
Yeah.
having an understanding and shared understanding of what resources are in that anticipated queue, and what do we have and what deficits, both for actually doing the business, but also for being able to advocate for resources. So if we say we know we have whatever $2 billion of projects in our intake that could be used and deployed, that will be helpful, I think, for advocating for resources to support development.
And so this process in general is like a rolling process for the time being. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I
Cool.
think again, details to be determined, but
Right.
my optimism is that we really are would be leaning toward rolling applications. So
Yeah.
let's take projects as they come, a little different than first come, first serve, right? You have to meet,
Right.
let's create a bar, let's make sure that we are doing this well, but so it's not a lottery, but it is, and having an active, page on the website that says what resources are available, what have conditional commitments, what are hard commitments, or into communities, so that you can be kind of really on it in an active basis, in an active way, understanding what we have available and what it is that we have to do. And I also seeing in the chat a couple comments kind of about the public funder role and jurisdictional role, both from Ellen and Jill. And absolutely, I think so. We need to be able to understand, and I really have deliberate connection with jurisdictions that fund both Jill and Portland Housing Bureau, but also any of the cities that invest. I think understanding that relationship where you are a jurisdiction that might fund one project a year or one project biennia, still making sure that you have understanding about what our process is, what we are looking at, and having that active relationship going. I do anticipate both that we are able to share these lists. I imagine in the intake list, there might be some aspects of that we would want to protect for confidentiality. Don't want people worrying over purchasing a property at some, intersection that might be well-kept secret of some sort. So I think wanting to balance that, right? So having giving transparency about what the high level is on the projects at that intake stage. And then as we are giving conditional commitments, adding more specificity to that. These are projects that have, really have relationship with us. And I know, and I think another piece of input on the Housing Stability Council side was, when is it they get understanding or preview of what these projects are looking like? I think so we need to kind of consider that role as we also figure out what this process is. Feel very much so that the approval place is when we are going from conditional commitment to commitment, and that what we really need that group largely to focus on is pinning down what the framework is, what our requirements, what our standards, what our evaluation criteria look like, so that we can confidently reflect these funded projects meet this framework and these objectives. So we need to kind of balance that plane a little bit, but I think again, the approval coming a little bit later. I also think I see a comment around the environmental review process. And so I think we need to have follow-up conversations with jurisdictions and with other HUD-related funders, because those are absolutely critical impact a timeline, and I think would tie back both to having active conversations to make sure that we are aligned and understanding each other's needs in that, and also then making sure that our benchmarks allow, you know, let's say we're saying like no more than 6 months in this, but this process that you need that commitment letter for takes 9 months because of a HUD and a jurisdiction request. Let's make sure that we have nuance and flexibility to do that. So I think to all of you that have given comments, I think we will be following up as we pin on the details. And I think, you know, as we are engaging today, would love any current thoughts on that what you want to flag.
I think, I mean, for myself, just hearing this tentatively, I think it's a really humane way of going about, you know, vetting projects and things, because like you said, the uniqueness of every deal and having this kind of rolling opportunity, because timing is always such a precarious thing in these deals. So I really think that this is personally at first blush, a great idea. So that's it, general feedback. Thanks for answering my questions.
Thanks, Steph.
Yeah.
And I also see, let's see. And so Shelley, I see the question on the QAP and the rolling. I think 100% we need to update. We will need to update the QAP. I think we will need to kind of gather all of the various programmatic updates that need to be reflected in manuals or rules. We are wrapping up our 9% NOFA right now. We will not have a 2024 9% NOFA because we pulled that earlier. And so that gives a little bit more time for when does the QAP need to be updated to reflect this new process. So I think, you know, I think yet to be determined. I think we will be, as we finalize the strategy, we will need to transition over into QAP as the process is working itself through. But I think that gives us a little bit more flexibility on timing. Our private activity bond and hence 4% solicitation has closed, and that will surely fill up the 2024 production queue for the 4% credit. So those would all have been onboarded again through our current QAP. So I think that is that, you know, so I think again, pressure to get it done before January or something isn't there, thank goodness. And I think it looks like, to Travis's question, looks like Kim might have just did a response, but I think, you know, absolutely, as we are thinking about, you know, all of these different pieces and we create this idea, and I think we need to get it another, you know, baked to 80%, so a little bit more than we have it right now. But, you know, Kim is driving the mental exercise of figuring out how we translate this into some iteration of a tabletop exercise where we can bring, you know, the perspective of lenders, we can actually, and a lender and a jurisdiction and a developer, and from, you know, a rural developer, an urban developer, and OHCS to the table, and really do kind of a mock exercise to be able to see, okay, if you have your project, what do we hit as we walk this through? It's not going to be this exactly the same as a full deal process, obviously, which takes a whole lot more than that. But I think we will do our best to really thoughtfully design that space and that opportunity to highlight unintended impacts and disconnects and process efficiencies. And so again, trying to get all of the pieces in place internally at OHCS so that we, as we are pinning down these, you know, getting this to 80%, we can actually do that kind of beta testing strategy and see, you know, it'll be a new fun experiment for us, but I'm really excited to be able to highlight that. Yeah, Shelley.
You say no 9% in 2024. PAP 4 has closed for allocations in 2024. So we have a lift deal that we're going to be trying for the third time. Is that going to be available to be submitted through this process, but probably not eligible for bonds until 2025? Is that kind of what you're thinking?
I think so. We need to figure that out. To be honest, I think we know, like, based on what we know of projects that have been funded either between housing authorities, Metro, and Lyft, that we have likely a production queue right now in private activity bonds that goes, so it goes through 2024. It looks to me to go at least through 2025. So of already funded projects. So I think we need to be very careful around not continuing to exacerbate this problem where there are projects that are ready, if not for private activity bonds. And so I think and we have not put the numbers, we have not agreed to the numbers. We haven't shared, so we haven't gotten to that internal place of agreeing on what we want to put out as a strategy on our funding calendar. But I would be really surprised if we are offering any ability to leverage resources that we commit in 2024 with private activity bonds because of what we already have in this queue. If we continue to do so, we are going to be funding projects that need to sit there for 2 or 3 years before we are able to access private activity bonds. And I also know that we need to balance it because we will need to have projects in 2026 that can use those resources. So I think kind of balancing all of those things will have some more clarity about what that recommendation looks like very soon. I'm hoping that we can be turning that back around to share in the near term. But I don't think we have it right now. But again, the private activity bond constraint is tremendously impactful to what we are going to be able to put out to leverage with our resources.
So just to follow up, did you do this presentation when you had your meeting with the cities this past week? Because I think Grants Pass participated, and we've got an MOU with them that now we're going to have to tell them that might not be good until like 2026, and hopefully they'll stick it out with us. But did you present this scenario when you had your meeting with the small cities this past week, so they know kind of the timing? And I'm just curious, if there's no 9% and there's really no bonds, preservation money that you got from the government or from the legislature that goes with bonds. So what resources are there going to be available in 2024? And when do you think you're at least going to get that out?
So Kim, I don't know if you want to say anything about the cities meeting.
Yeah. So when we convened with small jurisdictions and entitlement communities last Friday morning, and we did not present this detail, this came out during the Housing Stability Council after our meeting. But we did, spend some time with those public funders, and we will be circling back to the public funders. And, now that we have this more detail. So at that meeting, we did not discuss these particulars, but we will reach back out to them.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that we've talked about is I think I think for just trying to understand, I think the conversations have been really incredibly helpful for us. And I am also curious to understand the scale of all of the things. So I think I will be reaching out back to other public funders, and I think we have also talked about expanding that to all cities about what is it that they are thinking about, what is just trying to understand what are all of the projects and priorities in an aggregate way, so that we're kind of being able to make sure that we have response and as whatever consideration we can have. But I think Shelley, it will, again, from that relationship perspective, it is important that we are engaging and providing access to cities to be able to understand what our resources, what our priorities and funding process looks like, so that they are informed as they go into partnerships with developers, on our perspective and our role and wanting to prioritize and work collaboratively with jurisdictions who are trying to work in the housing space.
I think if we can take a question from Travis, then I want to make sure we can cover set asides. We are soliciting input today, so I want to make sure we have time to hear from you on some really key things around the benchmarks and milestones. So I'll move us along, but Travis, go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Kim. Just a real quick question. Did I hear correctly that you do not anticipate having private activity bonds available for concurrent with funding solicitations for other funds in 2024?
True. I don't anticipate, because I think that we have already gotten 3 times as many applications for resources as we have available for 2024 PAB. And so that is concerning. And so I think adding additional projects to that funded list that are not going to be able to access private activity bonds to move forward will do us a disservice. Do us globally, the we of it all. But
And I see,
yet to be pinned down and formalized.
And I see Martin has his hand up, probably to continue with this question. Is that correct, Martin?
Yes. So I guess given the kind of 3-to-1 over subscription in the most recent NOFA, is the idea that you're basically going to make forward commitments to get those kind of 3x projects kind of pipeline funded first before anything else gets funded? Is that the idea?
No, I think the hope is that we are able to move forward with the projects that can have private activity bonds. We then have all of the projects that the state has already funded that use them, that we will, I would be curious to see if there's other strategies to get them, and otherwise assume that they are kind of a 2025 need, and that in the near term we're funding projects that are able to move forward with either just Article 11Q or LIFT resources, or using 501c3 bonds, other strategies to be able to make deals work, and acknowledging and understanding that that will not meet the need for a lot of projects, including incredibly large projects. Okay, so I think, Kim, then for the next, we can just go into the next slide. So the next theme was really around, who it is that, the impact of this change process, and looking at this differently on, I guess was flagged very, very much very early on as unintended impact on small and culturally specific organizations, small nonprofits and other organizations. So, and I think in that vein, really wanting to make sure that we're using set-asides as an intentional way to hold access and resources, to protect those parts of deploying resources that might be missed if they are not held. And so I think we can go to the next slide. I think technical navigation is part of that, being able to provide supports, ties to pre-development resources and others. And then also in establishing some set-asides to protect investments to rural communities, protect investments to populations and partnership types. And so I think those are the types of set-asides that we are looking at and prioritizing under this vein of wanting to really thinking about set-asides as a way of holding resources to ensure impact to the places where you worry that there might not be. And so I think that's where we are. Again, we need to identify the funding calendar and strategies. And that is, I'm hoping that we're able to do that in the next, there's holidays start popping up here in November, but I do think over the next few weeks. And so I think then that goes to the next question and the poll. I talked earlier about, after project intake, what does that next review look like? And is it the impact, the policy, equity, and racial justice factors, and all of those considerations are financial. Again, I think our team is starting to pivot to thinking, evaluating the impact first before financial might actually make sense to prioritize and center equity, and all of the other things, but we're curious to do a poll and see what folks are feeling.
All right, so just open up the poll to get your reactions. It's okay to be unsure as well. We're going to talk a little bit more in our next exercise with you when we talk about some of the benchmarks and milestones that we're contemplating. And that might help with clarity, but looks like we're kind of split with yes and unsure. A few folks are saying no. Well, let's dig in a little bit more around this. So, and I don't want to miss Nora's question in the chat, which was about a rolling process and when projects will actually be scored. So maybe we can take that while I pivot to these discussion questions.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is the $600 million question, I think, Nora. I think to a very large degree, we have more resources than we have ever had in Article 11 Q bonds to put to projects. And so there will be, I think I'm hoping to focus largely on resources that don't need to be put out in a competitive fashion, and saying that we are able to offer them and will prioritize projects as they are ready and are entering into these steps. I do think that there might be resources that may have a need for a competitive process. And I don't know, and I think, thinking like 9% resources actually requires a competitive piece to that. I believe that we are trying to strike the balance and really lessen reliance on the competition factor. And if so, hopefully doing the competition piece earlier versus balancing it kind of earlier, but holding to clear benchmarks, so that if you are not progressing and you are not moving forward, that we are able to prioritize putting that resource to projects that are able to do so. I think, there's the preservation resources where I know Michael has talked about kind of establishing clear priorities for projects and investments types. And so that might kind of negotiate around, or, if we have clear priorities and we have clear placement on that, if project applies that has one of those top priorities, we would know that we have the ability to move forward with it without another competition perspective. So I think really trying to pivot mindset again away from being putting the explicit focus and priority around competing and more around getting housing produced. I think we've dug in, we haven't landed the plane on how it is that in a case where you need to do a competitive process, either by federal requirement or by the virtue that there are too many projects that need a resource, then is it a competition or is it a prioritization? And I think trying to understand what that is, and the hope that both the application team and the technical advisors are able to anticipate what are some of the strategies that would give you the highest levels of success to be able to consider what resources you are designing your project to use.
All right, thanks, Natasha. So we're going to do things a little bit differently today to get some of your input. I'm going to share my screen in a minute. We do have an easy retro board that we have pre-populated with just our kind of early thinking around benchmarks and milestones, but trying to keep these general questions in mind as you will view this retro board I'm going to show in a minute. But your recommendations around project milestones, benchmarks, And, for you to be thinking about the areas that shift most from initial concept to financial eligibility, things that, that are most concerning and that most, will detract a project, things that we want to take into consideration when we're looking at developing benchmarks and milestones. And then, as you look at these different sort of phases, intake, and financial eligibility, think about what is tied to a conditional commitment. So I'm going to stop sharing here and share an easy retro board with you. And the easy retro board will have the ability to vote on the different cards that are associated with the topic, but I'm going to wait and enable that in a moment. I just want to get this shared so you can see. Again, this is pre-populated, but it's not like predetermined. So we really are actively looking for you to give us your expertise on how we can, evaluate these projects together with you, right? Like we are trying to, in this new era with technical advisors and application team, trying to help move your project along. And so, as we think about elements that would be involved with project intake, basic concept, financial strategy, you've got your partners identified. We're going to talk to you maybe about pre-development needs. In this model, we've shifted and we have impact assessment coming before financial eligibility, but here are some things that we've identified that could be evaluated as milestones or benchmarks as your project moves through. Then moving on to financial eligibility and, reviewing your pro formas, meeting underwriting guidance. You've got lender and investor commitments, solid permit timeline, your HUD reviews are underway, and then over to project commitment where you've got your final documents ready to go, your 6 months to close. So please let me know if this makes sense. But what we're really hoping for here is, as you're thinking about those big picture questions about what sorts of things can be evaluated as benchmarks or milestones, and if they fit within these categories, if they are, really shifting a lot, and so we would need to, hear from you about, how we can take that into account as we're looking to put some of these things in place in the different phases of development. Natasha, is there anything else that you wanted to share? I will put this link in the chat too, so that you can add comments and you can start to, signal by, I'll enable the thumbs up if you agree that it belongs in that category. If you have questions or concerns, please raise your hand and we can talk about a particular thing. So this is, we're looking for really some active dialogue here.
Yeah, I don't think I have any anything else to add, I think, except that, this is very much wanting to get input and guidance and your thoughts on this. So please say what you are thinking.
How long will this be open for feedback? We can keep it open throughout the day. If that's helpful, if you want to take some time and add some comments here. So we'll leave it open for the remainder of the day here, but I can see folks are already starting to use the thumbs up if they're agreeing about different milestones within these different categories. So again, thinking about the impact assessment and looking to make sure your equity and racial justice strategies are identified. You've got your construction cost estimates also at this time frame. Shelley, go ahead.
Yeah, just a question on the project intake. I think as far as sponsor partners identified, I've expressed concern on our rural projects and the capacity of culturally specific and culturally responsive
Right.
organizations. Again, we just got denied on 2 for our 9% app because they don't have capacity. So this is where we'll be able to work with you all and talk to you all about what organizations we're identifying, and you can maybe start developing a list of those organizations that are out there that are responding that we don't have capacity. Yeah, that, you know, then how do you, then would your intake folks or whoever start reaching out to them as far as them trying to figure out how do they get capacity money from you so that they can partner with developers? So is this a good,
Okay.
is that kind of where you're looking at the sponsor partner identified?
Yeah, thanks for raising that. This you will be getting assistance from technical advisors and our team during project intake, and providing, you know, direction, guidance, recommendations for sure. Yeah. Brandon, go ahead.
Yeah, just had a comment about kind of planning on sponsor and partner identification intake. I know there's some times where, you know, you may have a design partner or a general contractor identified really early on in the process. Maybe they brought the property to you or something like that, but might not always have those partners identified. And I think like a plan for procurement would be probably a good thing to have in project intake, in lieu of maybe having that development team identified. Or like an alternative approach. So
yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. You know, you can also use there's an ability to click on a comment under each of these. So yeah, I would love, please, both Shelley and Brandon on this topic, if you have the ability to enter that comment, I think that would be great. Both great pieces of feedback there. Anything on impact assessment, financial eligibility that you have questions about or concerns about, you know, maybe how some of these things interact as well. So let's take this apart a bit.
I guess in the meantime, I did see, I'm just seeing Diana's comment in the chat, Kim, and I think just, you know, if any additional information that you have around the concern, Diana, I think you know, the governor's priority absolutely is you know, Executive Order 2304, increasing annual production, getting the affordable production increased to 18,000 units per year. That is an incredible goal, and it's you know, 5 times what we have already worked ourselves up to doing. And so she has, and the legislature has, invested in us doing this work, including the staffing that I talked through. Those were, you know, legislative investments in OHCS to stand up this work to make sure that we have sufficient structures and processes in place to really prioritize production. So that is the goal. And I think as we have taken that work internally to think about what that means, what fostering and supporting expansion of a pipeline, it felt important to us to be trying to put on collaborative hats to make sure that we're fostering moving all types of projects forward, not just those that are easy and quick to do, right, that come in fully baked. We want to make sure that we're supporting and investing in capacity. And I saw your hand, Diana, please. Maybe she doesn't.
I might have lost her. Let me just check here.
And I you know, and I do think, like, and I, you know, talked about this earlier a bit, but, you know, I think it feels a little, again, like as we've taken in all of what we have heard over the past several months and what we know about the work that we have done over the past decade in OHCS and in affordable rental housing specifically, really, you know, have prioritized and in a response and thinking about how do we address the input and feedback that you all have given us to date. And again, breaking apart what is right now a very concentrated, big NOFA process and kind of breaking that down to make each step sequential, try to follow a process, the very complex work of development in affordable housing. This is, you know, we don't know all of your business and you don't know all of ours, and think the two need to work well together. So figuring out that we are really trying to transition and pivot to say, how can we build our process to deconstruct what is that right now big block of competition. It does, you know, we say that and we've broken it in and like really created a step one, right? The intake, let's create that so we have real basis for interactions and can understand what's coming forward. And then what is now NOFA process is really, you know, a three stages of work there. And it is also important that if a project is ready, that they're able to just go through it, right? I don't like, not that I don't have any, and I don't think any of us have any intent or goals to say you need to sit in each step for 6 months. So really wanting to make sure that by deconstructing, we are also reinforcing that, saying if you are ready, that we are not, the holdup should not be our process. So let's make sure. It could be resource availability. We might not always have the right resources to match the project because those are not limitless, but it should not be our process that is impeding you moving forward. So if you have a ready project that can use the resources that we have available, I want to make sure that we are putting something in place that gives you clear understanding and pathways to moving it forward and getting the necessary input and response from us. Tracy.
Echo everybody's appreciation for the process and just the way you all have approached this with open-mindedness and humility. And then number two, as I'm looking at the UGZ retro board, I'm trying to think about, and maybe you've already done a lot of thinking about this, how do we keep this from being just a race, right? Who can get through? Because usually, not always, but often, it's the people with the most resources that can run these traps the fastest. And I know that is not the intent. And so as I'm sitting here thinking like, okay, how do we prevent that from just being who's fastest? I would love to hear if you guys have been thinking about that.
Absolutely. I think, anyway, it's one of those, if I were to stay up at night worrying about things, it would be private activity bonds and that. But I think, I think very intentionally, I think there's a role of set asides, number one, to say what is it that we want to hold set asides for? And I think that is likely regional. It is also likely type of partnership. So thinking about, I think we hear clearly from the nonprofit community, from the culturally specific conversations we have been engaging in, that those are specific and impactful infrastructure and kind of backbone of the state. And we need to make sure that we are investing through those organizations. And I think we are agreeing with you on that. I also think should not be a race. People will make it, put a point on a thing and you will get, you'll try to get that point. But I do think, you enter in, so let's say you have an intake that's, this work, we have set asides for resources in place, you submit, if the impact assessment is first, you set your own project specific benchmarks to that. So, and you get a conditional commitment. So we do that impact review. You've passed you've met all of the requirements for, demonstrating that you are aligned and have effective equity and racial justice strategies, that your partnerships are getting formed, all of the stuff that might be in that section. And then you have your conditional commitment, and your resources are not a risk now. You don't need to, you're not competing at that point with anybody else. You're competing with yourself and the timelines you told us you were going to meet. So, project A applies and says, okay, these are the, the 5 benchmarks that I told you I would be meeting. This is the timeline for when I will meet them. And you retain that conditional commitment as long as you're meeting them. And when you are ready, when you've met all of those, you should be ready to go into the next step of the process. And again, you retain your conditional commitment as long as you meet that. So I think part of that is the nuance of wanting to make sure that we have project specific, that projects themselves are generating their timelines, and that we are putting in place clear set-asides that are protecting and holding resources for where we want to make sure that, that our production impact and community reflects those groups. Jillian?
Yeah, thank you. I had a similar comment to Tracy, and I just really appreciate the way that the retro board is set up for us to kind of comment on and give advice about what things should be in what categories. And I think, for projects moving forward, it's I heard you loud and clear that there are no PABs. I think it keeps me up at night too. So you're not alone there in 2024. But when do you anticipate this new process rolling out for applications or for vetting or for technical assistance? Like, do you have a goal timeline in mind? I'm sure that I'm not the only person who has designs on applying for LIFT or PSH funding next year for projects closing in 25 or later. So I was just wondering if you had an estimate of that
For the, yeah. So I think
and when are we going to start being able to start vetting these projects?
Yeah. And so, I think for our process in its whole, I think we're aiming to finalize frameworks with Housing Stability Council in early, getting it beginning December, shifting through January and February to pin it all down, hoping that we can turn it on March, April. And earlier than that, we need to be finalizing a funding calendar and those recommendations. And so I think, so I guess that's the kind of essence of timing. Private activity bond layer and when we are going to add more projects into that private activity bond queue is a bit of a TBD. Again, concern around continuing to add more projects into this place. I think as I've been talking with jurisdictions and housing authorities and seeing this constraint, I think feeling like wanting to set project investments up for success, knowing that they'll be able to move forward. And so I think, so the timing of offering March, April is the goal. This is a big lift. So not to be, I won't make a silly lift joke, but get a little punchy. My coffee very quick this morning. But yeah, so I think that is kind of the near term step. And, prior to that, we'll be circulating for input discussion. We'll decide what other active discussion spaces we need to create to pin down subsidy limits and resource availability and all of those. But so those will be kind of moving again. Then we'll start trying to really describe this plan, get it to 80%. We'll do some of the tabletop exercises, engage with lenders to make sure that we are, as we're thinking into the details of each of these steps, that we are making sure their expertise is reflected back into that. We've gotten some generic information and really feel like we need to get to 80%. So it's active and engaged feedback. And then we have enough to walk through a tabletop, which I think we have planned for February. So the amount of coordination and process here is a little daunting as I think through all the steps. And so I
got a few holidays in there as well.
And we do, just a couple, no biggies though, right? Just all of them, but yeah.
Right. Well, I think, thank you for that. I think knowing the timing of that is really helpful. And then, of course, whatever anything you need from developers in order to do that tabletop exercise is we're all interested in making this process the best it can be.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Jillian.
Well, I skipped ahead to the next step slide, but I do appreciate people continuing to populate that Easy Retro board. There's already a lot of great information in there that will be really useful to us. And we can take a few questions as we prepare to close out. Okay, Diana, thanks for getting back to us saying your microphone's not working. We appreciate you elevating your concerns about readiness, and thank you for that. And I see Melissa has her hand raised.
Yeah, just wondering, you've sort of referenced a follow-up or a circle back to public funders a couple of times. I'm just wondering what that's going to look like, especially considering it sounded like you're in the next few weeks going to try to dial in what your funding calendar might look like. So yeah, just will that be like sort of a conversation? Will it be individualized? Will it be kind of a report out?
So the near term step, which I'm hoping to get out, say tomorrow's a holiday, it's unlikely this week, but if not early next week, kind of an overview of where we are, a written correspondence and request for information, and then I think we will schedule, likely want to schedule additional conversations as we get a little bit further. But I think near term, like very near term, imminent, in my drafts folder is kind of thinking about what it is we want to be laying out, making sure we're highlighting all of this, and then be able to get kind of, you know, into a little bit of weeds of information from public funders, both about your timelines as well as resources, leverage, anticipated needs, and those types of things. Because I feel like I know pieces of it, we know pieces of it, but trying to see what this big picture looks like will be really valuable to, you know, figure out how we are building in intentional alignment with jurisdictions and really wanting to, through this process, prioritize and invest in community and inception of ideas and projects that are meeting needs identified through jurisdictions, as well as having all opportunity, but I think really wanting to have that be a critical voice in our of collaboration in our process.
Thanks so much.
Any other questions before we wrap up here? Anything we want to go back to the Easy Retro?
I see the Ryan's question on the and hilarious joke on Lyft.
Yeah.
But I you know, I think likely the survey, is that true?
Oh, yes. So I think Trinity put a link to the engagement survey in the chat. We'll put that in again, and I'll send an email out with that link again in case you missed it. And, you know, it has an opportunity to, thanks, Trinity. It has opportunity to, you know, put anything else you want to submit to us. So that survey will be available for the next week. So please use that tool. That would be really helpful.
Absolutely. And so I think Bill's question, I'm glad that this is it seems overall feeling positive and a lot. And I think just to kind of across everybody's feedback, understand that, believe it completely. And so I think just, you know, processing time, will be really curious to see what other reflections you want to offer as we you know, have the survey open and others to participate. I think part of what my hope is, you know, I think to the question that Bill is raising, which is like, how are we not just building too many projects into a queue where we don't have resources available? And I think that needs to be, and we need to really strike that balance. But I do think that we should not be creating conditional commitments for projects that we don't have resources for. So, and that we are also on a biennial schedule. And so this should hope, I mean, you know, the dream would be that we are not having to do a substantial recast between legislative sessions. You know, our current process on the NOFA structure is kind of let's hold it all, let's process it new and different. But if we have and expand opportunities to be able to put projects through, and in that intake space, be able to really actively say, you know, this is where the status of these resources and the availability is. And so I think continuing to have a really hat-in perspective and risk tracker on getting ourselves to over our skis. What happened to the private activity bonds is a lesson I certainly never want to have to learn again. So I think appreciate both the flag, and I think is we need to memorialize and reflect that in our policies as we create this, so that it is not a risk that we neglect over time. And I also see question on the way the apps are scored. I think the app, yes, we are absolutely changing the way applications are scored. I think breaking it into the different steps, you know, looking at different pieces at different times in a sequence, and also with the idea that we want to establish in an environment where we are not focusing on competing two projects against each other, that we need to establish what our requirements, what our baseline expectations are. I don't think that's going to be a very low bar, but I think it's going to be a reasonable bar. You document how you are meeting our requirements, and that would give both forward transparency to you about what is needed, and also greater predictability over whether you will be able to continue to move forward. We will also have technical advisors providing, you know, being able to provide input and feedback as you go. And I also have to acknowledge in this, these are new bodies of work. We are starting out with 3 technical advisors. That team might need to grow over time, and they won't be able on day one to have, you know, do all the things. So we need to kind of figure out how that work is prioritized, but absolutely need to be also creating clear programmatic, probably the program team maybe, but the like term sheets, like let's highlight the key way these resources work, that's kind of are additive to the manuals and guidance. I also, and I'm just trying to charge ahead, I know we're done with timing here. I think the last question on here from Jeremy is ties to pre-development fund. I do think that is, and Mitch, you can give me a face if I'm saying it wrong, but I think likely to be tied to the input stage. And so kind of earlier work to be able to get you ready to be able to move forward on those. I think critically, critical for me to say is that in processing through all of the input and feedback around pre-development, I just want to clarify that accessing pre-development resources does not guarantee that there will be resources when you are ready. And so those are 2 different types of investments, and it shouldn't make it less likely that you move forward, but it is not a guarantee. It is not a conditional commitment for the final funding for your project. So that is a need that we need to balance to make sure that when we are doing true commitment of resources or projects, that is based on evaluation under our impact and financial process versus upfront screening on a pre-development investment.
All right. Well, we got through a lot. And thank you all for sticking with us through the 6 Zoom meetings. It's been wonderful to have so much engagement and great input as we are considering this new process. And a question here about the video will be posted to the website. These things take a bit to whatever they do, they have to download, and so we'll try to get it posted, but it can take a day sometimes for it to initialize or whatever magic that happens.
It's like convert formats and all
right,
that.
But we will do it as soon as we can, and get that posted on the website. So with that, I will send a follow-up email to the participant list with the survey link and the PowerPoint presentation from today. And Natasha has some work that she's got in her drafts inbox that is waiting for her, so more correspondence to come. And of course, we'll be at Housing Stability Council on December 1st with an update for them as well. So I think with that, Natasha, we're at 12 o'clock. Any closing remarks?
No, I think I probably have talked in your ears enough for lifetimes today. So just, again, gratitude. I really appreciate you all participating in what is a very large shift in our practices, and really do believe in earnest that this is going to have positive impacts on our production across the state, meeting needs, being able to prioritize and center equity and racial justice across all of our efforts in a consistent way that tracks out to outcomes and measurements, and that we will in earnest commit to process clarity and continued evaluation as we identify where there are roadblocks or unanticipated consequences. I really want to make sure that we do that, and have to acknowledge that we will need grace, as it will not be perfect on day one. And so we'll do our very best, but this is a process, so I appreciate it.
All right, thanks everyone. Take care.
Thanks.